Hey guys, welcome back to part 2 of the JKU gear swap. The front axle will be similar to the rear except for a few details that I go over, so stay tuned for those. For the front axle, you need to remove the front locker sensor in order to remove the pinion. And then you can use a long pry bar to knock out the axle seals on both sides, and then use brake cleaner and rags to clean out the inner axles. So on the back side we've got the seal, the oil slinger, and the rear bearing. We need to punch out the races, and then on the inner race there is a actual little washer or deflector that goes on before the race. So let's punch out this race from the other side. This front pinion bearing race, we have this baffle and it goes under the actual race. So here's the actual orientation of it. So let's hit the old one out and we'll put this new one back in. So now we're going to hit in the bearing race. I'm going to start with the rear. I did put it in the freezer to help with inserting it. So now we can do the front bearing race. Add a little bit of grease just to help it slide in there, and then don't forget about this little piece here. They really only go in one way because it won't fit on the race the other way. Another tip I have is grab your driver tool and see the angle that it comes out. That way you can not be thinking you need to hit the hammer like this or like this. It comes straight out. This will start to get tight. You hear that sound difference? That higher ting means it's all the way in. And this cannot wiggle anymore. So now we need to get our seals pressed in. And just like that, both seals are in. So we've got our old pinion spacer, put that on the new pinion, and then we've got our setup bearing. And then I already had a crush sleeve eliminator on the other front pinion, so we'll use these to see how it's set up. So put those on, and then you take your other setup bearing and put that on. And again, this crush sleeve will determine how close these bearings are together and how tight they are in the actual races. Now it's time we can insert this into the axle. First we're going to check to see if this amount of spacing gives us a good amount of pinion preload. The pinion spun too easily, so there was too much distance between the two bearings. So we need to remove this crush sleeve eliminator and decrease the amount of spacers that we have between it. If you're not using a crush sleeve eliminator, you would be using a actual crush sleeve, and then if you didn't have enough preload on the bearings, you would just tighten it down a little bit more. Because these can easily get over tightened, and then you have to get a new one and restart. So that's why we use the crush sleeve eliminator. It's hard to get into spec, but once it is, it's harder to mess up. So we're going to remove one of these spacers. With removing that spacer, it made the pinion preload almost perfect. But once we install the new bearings onto the pinion, we will have to check the preload again and possibly adjust the spacers. So now let's move on to installing new bearings onto the carrier. And don't forget to add a little grease on it. And this will be the same procedure for the front and rear carrier. A little spacer that's the exact size. You want to make sure when you're pressing this on, you can still spin the bearings. Because if you're up on the race and you can't spin the bearings, you're going to ruin it. So you want to make sure you can still spin it. still spinning freely, still spinning freely. You want to make sure both bearings can spin freely. And just like that, your bearings are pressed on. Now we can put on the ring gear. Make sure you clean off your bolts with brake cleaner, and then you need to use red Loctite to bolt them on. This ring gear actually fits on the carrier very nicely. It's not too snug, so I don't have to heat it up. Like the rear axle, I did have to heat up the ring gear in the oven, 220 degrees for 20 minutes, and it slides right on. But this one, I don't have to. Using the provided installation booklet, Dana 44 JK front, ring gear bolt 135 foot-pounds. So I'm putting the carrier on the axle, and I'm using that to hold it. And then I activated the locker so the carrier doesn't want to spin. And tighten them in a star pattern. And once you find a good position, go with it. Be careful with a conventional torque wrench not to over tighten it at this angle. And just like that, the ring gear is torqued all the way down. Now it's time to put the carrier in for the first time. Make sure you lube up the bearings with some gear oil. Use your original shims. For the front axle, I had to move the shims around several times just to get the backlash perfect. When you do this, usually you'll move like 4/1000ths of a shim over from one side to the other, depending on whether or not you need more or less backlash. And here's me pulling the carrier out several times just to get the backlash perfect, making small adjustments with the shims. All right, so I got my backlash all set. I'm right at 8/1000ths, and it's recommended to be between 6 and 10 thousandths. So now it's time to check our pattern. Got a little bit of the paint. I'm gonna add a little bit of oil to it. And these are with the mock bearings on the pinion, not the final bearings. So it looks like a good pattern. So now we're going to pull the carrier out, pull the pinion out, and we're going to put on the final pinion bearings, and then we will reinstall it all. And make sure you have the shims underneath the new bearing before you press it on. When installing the pinion with one person, this is the best method to hold the pinion in there while you're tightening up the pinion nut. So now we are checking pinion preload, and this is way too much. So we need to add some shims to the crush sleeve eliminator. And this is an acceptable pinion preload. And now that the pinion preload is set, you can now check the pattern one more time. And I would also check your backlash, just in case that changed a little bit. And if your pattern is good, you need to pull the carrier out. That way you can reinstall the locker sensor. And you're gonna have to put something in the plunger and tie a string to it. That way you can install the carrier with the plunger pushed out. And then pull the string once the carrier is installed. But make sure the locker solenoid is oriented so that the bearing cap can stop it from spinning before you release the plunger. And again, apply red Loctite to the bearing cap bolts and torque them down to 80 foot-pounds. And don't forget to plug in your locker plug. Next, we're going to remove the pinion for the final time. That way we can install the new oil slinger and install the oil seal. Make sure you apply red Loctite to the pinion nut. That gets torqued down to 160 foot-pounds. And I do that once the tires are on the ground. Alright, so make sure when you're putting this locker sensor back in and you're installing your carrier, you have this straight here where the actual lock would be holding it. If you tighten the carrier down and this is up a little bit, you're gonna bend this sensor and it's not gonna work. It's not gonna tell you that it's activated. And that's what I did. I bent here. And I had to pick up a new one from the parts store, so don't make this mistake. Time to reinstall the diff cover. You're gonna torque it down to 30 foot-pounds and make sure the surfaces are clean on the diff cover and the differential. You got your wheel bearing bolts, 75 foot-pounds, 3 of them. You've got your caliper bracket bolts, 120 foot-pounds. You want to tighten all those down. Make sure when you're putting in your axles, you're very gentle with the inner axle seal. That way you don't damage it. And I also added some grease onto the axles. That way they slide into the seal nicely. And then we're gonna bolt up the track bar and torque that down to 125 foot-pounds. Then we will reattach the tie rod end links and torque those down to 63 foot-pounds. Put the tires on and we'll get this thing put back together. Once you put on the tires, you can install your axle nut using that 36mm socket and torque that down to 100 foot-pounds and use red Loctite on the axle nut. And that is how you swap your gears out. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. So let's talk a little bit about what happened, about the failure. This is the pinion here. It looks like I had an actual gear tooth crack out of here. And even the one next to it cracked also. And then this piece, this chunk went right into the actual side of the carrier. This is a 5/13 gear ratio. The ones that I decided to go with is 456. The reason I went 456 is because I've got the 6.4 Hemi and I've got enough power to push it through the gear. I don't need high RPMs to make the Jeep move. And then also the 8-speed transmission, I've got a lot of different variation with actual gears. So I've got a lot of room to go. And I drive the Jeep a lot of different places, whether it's going up to Utah, California, Colorado. The other big difference between a 513s and a 456 or similar 488s is the pinion is a lot bigger. A lot thicker. So you can see the difference in size. This is the 456. Going up to a 513s, it gets a lot smaller. The actual ring gear, they're very similar, but the pinion is where you get the biggest difference. And I'm definitely not easy on my Jeep. Even though I'm on the stock Rubicon 44s. But that is part of fun of owning a Hemi Wrangler. The main purpose of posting these videos is to share knowledge. So if you have something to add or a tip or trick, please leave a comment. That way other viewers can read your comments as well. Again, don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching. And now that we've gotten done with our first 500 miles, time to change out the fluid. I would expect the fluid to look a little bit gross after this first 500 miles, but there shouldn't be any big chunks on the magnets. There can be little tiny pieces on the magnets, that can be normal. But if you see any big chunks, something's obviously wrong. Also, if you heard any gear whining or if you heard anything weird out of the axle, I would definitely take off the diff cover and inspect them. And then let all the fluid drain out and then fill it back up. With the regular stock diff covers, you will fill until it starts draining out the hole, and then you can put the plug in. And I put a little bit extra and then put the plug in. With the aftermarket diff covers, the holes don't really line up exactly as the stock ones do, at least with these Yukon ones. I just go off the capacities that are online. Put 1.5 quarts up front and then 2.5 quarts in the back. Just like that, your gears are fully done and you did it yourself in your garage with your own tools and your own knowledge. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, if you learned something from this video. And again, thanks for watching.